Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this is sort of React in one video. It's not every little detail about React, but enough to go from zero to hero in one video and get a nice, not just like how to do it, but a nice overview of how to think like React, or think in a React way, because that's where really you're going to get the power of the React library. So what is React? React is a library for building your user interface, so to build your front-end logic. And essentially what you're doing is you're going to chop up your UI into little pieces called components. Think of like building like Lego blocks. And you're defining all the little Lego blocks that you're going to use to build your website, and then you're going to assemble them. Cool. That's sort of the basic idea, and we'll kind of illustrate that a little bit better as we go on. But first we need to actually set it up. So let's do that. So create a new folder. So I'm going to have a folder here called our first practice. I'm going to just close these. And you need two files in that practice folder, a app.js and an index.html. In that index.html, we're going to create some boilerplate. And basically, first thing we need to do is bring the React library into our file. So you can go to this website, reactjs.org/doc/cdn-links.html, or just Google React CDN. And these two script tags bring in React. And why is there two script tags? Because there's technically two libraries here. There's the React library, which is this one right here. And what this does is that this is basically how React works. This is kind of like how React thinks. It's the brain of React. The problem is you create all this React code, suddenly the browser doesn't know how to read it. The browser doesn't know how to turn it into HTML that shows up on the screen. So React DOM takes your React code and turns it into something that can be used in an HTML browser. So this is why, like, if you were to do like React Native, which is like the mobile version of React, you still use the React library, but you replace React DOM with the React Native library, which translates it for mobile phones. Okay, so the React library always has a companion library that turns it into what you need for where you're outputting the library to. Okay, neat. So that's what these two libraries do. So we brought those in. The thing is that when you're coding in React, you're going to be using a lot of very cutting edge JavaScript stuff that the browser just doesn't know what it means. It's going to look at your JavaScript and be like, I don't know what's going on here, because we're going to be using something called JSX, which is something that Facebook created that looks a lot like HTML. But essentially what it is, it's a way to create your DOM logic in a syntax that looks like HTML that then gets translated into normal standard sort of JavaScript DOM logic. The DOM being the document object model. Think of it as your browser window. Cool. So we need something that's going to translate our app.js into code that the browser can understand. So we need to bring in Babel. So we're going to look up the Babel CDN. Babel CDN. Babel, what it does is that it takes sort of newer JavaScript code and newer syntax of different types and translates it to older syntax. So it'll take our cutting edge JavaScript stuff and our JSX and turn it back into normal JavaScript. So we're just going to copy the CDN link here, copy the script tag, and we'll put that in there. Cool. Almost done. Two more pieces, and then we'll never have to touch this HTML file again. Next, we need to put the script tag for our JS. So script source. Okay, we need to link to our app.js file, which is in our folder. And we need to let it know that it should use Babel to translate it. So we have to use type equals, should be like text/Babel. Okay, so that just means, hey, use Babel to render this file. And app.js, charset, good, and that's all good to go. Now that React DOM library, what it's going to do is going to inject stuff into our DOM. Usually the way a React library works is you have one big giant like Lego brick. It's called your app component. And then everything else is a child of your app component. So the idea is we just need a place to inject that sort of top level app component. And we're going to, and generally the way it's always done is you create a div, You're going to give it the ID root. You don't have to do it this way. You could do it this way. You do div ID root, and that's it. Okay? So technically, we have everything we need for our code to work here. So everything is all hunky-dory here. Then we're going to go to our app.js, and now we just start making our app component. So again, you always start with one component. You don't have to. You could inject multiple components into the HTML, but it gets, I don't know, it's just the way it's always done. And we're going to start off with class components. So the way it works is, since we're using a CDN, I don't have to do any imports or anything. We create a new class, and then we'll call the class app. The first class is always called app. It doesn't have to be, but this is just convention. It's going to extend React.component. Okay? That's the class that's inside the React library that has all the information on how a component works. So we're extending that class. Okay, and basically there's only two things you need to do. You need to create the constructor. And inside the constructor, we just need to invoke the parent constructor, super. That's done. Okay, the basic is set. And we have to define a render function. And the render function is where we define what does the component look like. So you're going to return what's called JSX, and it just basically looks like HTML. Okay? So usually what you do is you create two parentheses, and then you put basically HTML here. So h1 hello world /h1. Now, JSX is not exactly HTML, so it does have certain rules you have to follow. Like one, first let's see, this should work. Okay, so right now this should already be working. It's saved. Since there's only one thing going on, it just gets rid of the parentheses. But let's see here, say it's saved. And we'll kind of explore the JSX rules by breaking them and seeing how it doesn't work when you break them. But first, how do you run this? Because if I just open this index.html in the browser, it will not work. So watch, if I go show the file manager, I click on the index.html, I hit open with Chrome, this is not going to work. I'm just going to get a blank page. Because what you need is you need a web server running for this to run fine. So one way to do this is you can install Light Server. So if you have npm, if you don't have npm, you need to install Node. Go to nodejs.org and download Node. Okay, but basically we just type in npm I for install light, or actually before light, -g light server, and this will install Light Server globally on your computer so you can use it whenever you want. Okay, so easy peasy. Now if we want to use it, you just type in Light Server, and it's going to spin up a server right in that folder. So basically a Node JavaScript server will just spin up and serve files statically from that server. So now it sees that, it finds my index.html. I think I opened it from the wrong folder. Control C. Yep, I need to go into practice 1. And then do Light Server. Okay, let that start up. Go. And we don't see the hello world, so that means I made some sort of syntactical mistake. So let's find out. Take a look at our error here. Oh no, not a syntax mistake. I just forgot one thing. I have this component here, but how does it know where to put it in the DOM? Okay, so basically what you have to do is you have to inject this first component into the DOM. And the way that works is you're going to say React DOM, because we're referring to the React DOM library, React DOM.render. And this takes two arguments. It's going to take what we're going to render. So we're going to render the app component. All these components turn into HTML tags like this. Okay, so I'm going to render the app component. And the next piece is where. I'm going to do it in that div that has the ID root. So I'll do document.get element by ID root. So basically saying, hey, inject this component here. So as a child of that root div. Okay, and now this should be working. And there you go. See, it took that app component and put it right there. Okay, and if we take a look at elements and we look at the div, we see there's the component. And you don't see the tag, you don't see the app tag, because all that's happening is that React DOM is injecting what's in the component into the DOM. Now our first rule of JSX we need to talk about is that there can only be one parent, one top level component. So if I do this, if I were to do this, h2 goodbye world slash h2, so you can see the coloration's already off because this component is not a child of this, and vice versa. You can't have two components at the same level. The way you fix that is you create what's called a fragment. So it's just an empty tag and then an empty tag with a slash, and that becomes the new parent tag. So you see everything is wrapped in this, what this is called a fragment. Okay. Nice. Okay, so it's an easy thing to get around, but you have to, but basically, if you're not aware of it, you'll easily break that rule all the time. You keep trying to just put in a bunch of tags and not realizing everything needs to be wrapped in something. Okay, so in that case, that would work. So I hit save. Okay, it does that. And let's wait for it to render. Okay, yep, nope. And another rule is you have to make sure that something's on the same line with that first parentheses. So I'm going to have to turn off prettier, because otherwise prettier will not let me do that. Otherwise, usually prettier is so helpful. But the prettier settings I have right now are a little fickle regarding that, and I'm not going to go play around with those settings right now, so we're just going to turn it off. So let's just wait for the packages to load and turn off prettier. Here it is. Okay. So what I need to do is move this back here. Okay, it can't be on like a separate line, because basically what the parentheses means is an implied return or implicit return, and it gets confused if you don't do that. Okay, so now it should work. Oh, still complaining. Let's take a look. It's not liking my fragment, so I'm going to take the fragment out for now. So we'll just replace it with a div. See if that fixes the problem. That's another thing you can just do. You can just always wrap it in a div. Or span if you don't want it to be a block. And there it is. Okay, cool. Very nice. Okay. Now, that's all fun and good, but what makes React super powerful is when you start mixing it with like different types of information. So, and then also making small components. So the idea is you want to keep breaking down your UI. So your app component should only really be made up of other components, and then those components have other components, and you want to try to break down your UI into its smallest pieces. So the next step is we'll make another child component. So we'll create another component. So we'll just go here and start making another component. We're going to make a class called counter. We're going to make a counter component that extends react.component. And we're going to create the constructor. We have to call this the super. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to use something called state. Okay, you can make as many variables as you want inside your component, but the idea is that you want to ask yourself two questions. Is this particular variable, one, does it control something that's visual in my element, something that people are going to see? And will it and two, will it ever change? Okay, and that means if it changes, I kind of want it to update the element. So in that case, if those two things are true, it should be part of your state. Okay, so think of state as an object. So this dot state equals an object. Right now we're just going to have one property in it, but literally anything you plan on using, you're going to want to put into this object. Okay, so this dot state, we're going to use a counter or count property, and we'll start it with 0. Okay, and that's our state. Now that state, we can put in, now we need to create a render function. Render, so what we're going to render, return, and what we're going to render is an h1, and between the h1s we're going to have this dot state, so we're going to access that state thing, and we're going to access its count property. So that's how you pull in variables into your JSX. You use a single curly bracket, and you just put in the variable you want. And you can actually put any JavaScript expression. So it doesn't just have to be a variable name. You could put like a ternary operator or a function. It just has to return something, some sort of value. Okay, and in this case, this should, now we want, so we're going to replace this with our new counter component. So in this case, this will just say counter slash. There's our component plopped into the JSX of our app. So you see, I have one brick, and I put a smaller brick inside that brick. And basically everything's going to, basically you're creating your own DOM tree in a sense. This is what's referred to as the virtual DOM. And basically, every time we change this variable, so there's going to be a way to change this state. Whenever we change this state, if we do it the right way, it's going to force this component to re-render. But since the state's here, it's only going to re-render this, not app. App will not go and change. That's the beauty of React. That you can change different parts of your app, you can change the data, and your components will just update themselves. But you want that state, that data that triggers the update, to be as low as possible. You don't want, you could theoretically put all your state in app and then just pass the data down. Problem is, then every time you change the data, app re-renders and everything else re-renders because everything is below app. And the problem with that is you're just wasting memory, you're making your website slower. To get the speed benefit, you only want the components, the pieces of your website that need to change and nothing else. And that's sort of why we talk about state. You always want state to be as low as possible. So if you imagine all your components and how they connect to each other as a tree, you generally want those components to be, you want the state to be at the bottom of that tree. But first, let's just show you how state works. So first, let's just show you that it does show up on the screen. So if we go over here, so we see 0. Okay, again, where did that 0 come from? Okay, that 0 came from state. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create a way to change it. So we're going to create a function. We'll just call it add1. Okay, no parameters. And what all this function does is we use this. You have to use a function called setState. You have to use it this way. You can't just change the state directly. You can't just be like this dot state equals this now. If you do that, it will not work. Because the setState function does two things. It updates your state, then re-renders your component. So this dot setState, then you pass in a new state. So you're going to pass in a new object and with a new version of my 0, so a new version of count, but now count is going to equal this dot state dot count, the old count, plus 1. So basically the first time I click the button, it's like this is 0, because that's what we defined it up here. This is 0, and we add 1 to it, and that becomes the new count. And we just keep doing it. But when you run this function, it's automatically going to know, oh, you change this? Let me rebuild the component. And you'll see the changes on the screen. So let's create a button. Okay, so we'll just wrap this in a div. Div. Okay. Then I'll put this on a separate line as well. Div with a slash. Okay, I'm going to create a button. Other rule of JSX is that when you're doing events, like click events, you can't do this like you usually would. So in HTML, you would just write on click and you're good. Not in JSX. In JSX, it's camel case. So it's on click. And then here, I would just use my curly brackets to pull in the function. So that'd be this dot add 1. So every time you click it, you don't put a parentheses because it'll automatically invoke the function right away. So this dot add 1. Cool. And that is that. But one other issue is that when you, this has to do with just because we're using a class. There's that whole issue with like the this keyword in JavaScript. So if you just click the button, this is technically going to be the button, not your component. We don't want that. We want this to be the component. So what we have to do is do a this dot bind this. There's a couple other ways you can do it. So we'll show you a couple different ways. Okay, so what this does, it just says that going forward, this is this. Because right now, when this runs, this is the component. I know that sounds really confusing. I highly recommend watching a video. There's a few videos, especially I think one from a YouTube channel called Fun Fun Function, that really helps nail down how this works in JavaScript. It's one of the weirdest and slipperiest things in JavaScript. Cool. So and then let me actually close that button tag. So close the button. The button will say click me / button. Okay. Save. Okay, and then here is my code. Okay, so there's my component. Here's my add one function. This is calling the add one function because again I use this because this is a class and it's a method of the class. So now I have my button, and if I click this, it should update the state to add one. And see, it automatically updates. I didn't have to do any, this .inner HTML and add append child or none of that. It just does it for me. Okay, that's the beauty of React. It does one-way data binding. Okay, it doesn't go two ways, just one-way data binding. Okay, every time I update this thing called state, it's going to cause a full component to rebuild itself. Cool. Now another way I could have binded this is I could do something like this. I could be like, self equals this. I think this should work, so let's give it a shot. So in that case, let's see here. If I just change this to self, I should probably make that a const. Const self equals this. And self.add1, I can get rid of the bind this because self has been assigned to the components. And that should still work. We'll find out in a moment. Nope, that doesn't work. I thought it would. Oh well. Okay, so basically you have to use that bind function. Later on, you should learn how to make function components, and you don't have to worry about the this keyword ever again. So this dot add one dot bind this. So any kind of click functions, any event functions, you kind of have to do that, which is annoying, but it is what it is. Cool. Save. So that's state and how state works. There's also something called props. So here, where I called the counter function, what I could do is I could pass in something. We'll say, word equals count. Any information that I pass this way is referred to as a prop. Prop is just short for properties, so the properties of the component. And this is already built into React.component. So when you call super, it's already kind of setting up props for you. It's done. You don't have to think about it. It's there. So now I can do this. I can be like this dot props dot whatever we called it up here. We called it word. So it'd be this dot props dot word. And then I'll put a colon. Save. And let's see it update. And see, now you have the word count there. Now where's that word count coming from? Coming from the props of the component. We define that up here. And I can just change it to whatever I want. And I can add more props. Okay? So I can add a prop called hello. And it'll equal cheese. You can add as many props as you want. Okay? And we'll console log the prop so you can see what it is. Console.log this.props. Save. Okay, it's re-rendering, and I guess it doesn't exist yet. So let me put it. I think props must then be controlled, or must be created at the point we run the render function. So let's control X, and then I'll put this console log props above the return, just so we can see it. And see, there it is. So anything I add as a prop into the component, when I create the component, gets passed in as props into the render function. Very useful. Okay. Definitely something to take advantage of. Cool. So I'm going to get rid of that for now. And you can do all sorts of things with props. Like I can pass in a full component. So let's say I do this. Okay. I can actually say, I can actually, let's create another component first. Class, we'll just say class cheese, because this is just an example. Class cheese extends react dot component constructor super render, and we're just going to return h1 cheese. Cool. So now we have this component that's just basically prints cheese. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually put that component as a prop to counter. So I'm actually passing it down as a prop to counter. Okay. And basically you would just do this. Let me think about that for a second. Yeah, I think you would just pass it in like this. Cheese. And that would be the value of hello. Okay, so I just pass in the component as a prop. And then if I go down here, back to my JSX for the counter component, I can just do this. This dot props dot, I think, was it hello? Yep, hello was the cheese component. So this dot props dot hello, so it looks at the props, it looks for the hello prop and sees that there's a cheese component, and that cheese component should end up being sort of rendered right there in that spot. So that's another way you can actually pass whole components around. Boop, 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 boop. And there it is, cheese. Okay. So that's a cool and useful thing to do. Okay. You can actually pass whole functions down. So you could actually pass, like if I wanted to, I could pass the set state function of the parent in there. So let's say I did, but it doesn't really matter there. Yeah, that's fine. Cool. So what we've learned is we learned how to use props. But when you change props, the only time that the component re-renders is when that set state function is run. Okay, so we want to keep track of when that gets run. Yeah. And when I change that state, all that's being updated is this. When I change this counter thing, it's only updating counter, not updating app. That's the beauty of React. Okay, so cool. So now you've seen how to do a class component. Okay, you guys got the general idea. Now let me show you how to do a functional component, which is much easier. Okay. Okay, so class. Actually, you don't even have to do class anymore. You just create a function. So it'll be like const. We'll make counter again. We'll just recreate counter as a functional component. Const counter equals. Now props, the way props works with a functional component is that it gets passed into the function. So you have to make sure there's a parameter to access props. So counter equals props. You can call it whatever you want. Okay. And there we go. And then basically what I would do is I would just hit, you don't have to even do a render function, you just return, and use return JSX. So in this case, we would return, right now we'll just return, again, we'll just start with the div, wrap everything in a div, and then what we're going to do is we'll just show you that the props are still available. So it'd be, but except now we don't have to use the word this anymore. So now it'd just be props.word and then props.hello. And that's it. That's a function component. Okay, see, that's a lot cleaner. I don't have to write all that constructor stuff. I don't have to use the word this. That's pretty nice. Okay. So now this is going to load up. Cheese is not defined. Oh yeah, I deleted cheese. That's right. So let's just change the value of hello. And we'll just change it to hello. And let's let it load up. There it goes. See, count hello. I didn't put any space in between them, so that's the deal there. They're just two words right next to each other. Count hello, but it works. Okay. So now let's actually start rebuilding our count. So we need to actually rebuild state. How does state exist in a function component? For the longest time, function components didn't have state. So every time you wanted to have state and have the automatic re-renders, you would have to build a class component. There was no other choice. But now you have something called hooks that allows us to create state in a component, in a function component. So how do you do that? You would just do this. You do const. You're going to use the structuring. So basically, the first variable, state, is our state. The second variable is going to be our setState function. And then you have to do equals react dot use state. And then we pass in here our original state. So here's our original state, hello. And again, or actually count. And count equals 0. Okay, so there's our state. So basically what happens is that this is going to return a state, the state as state, and it's also going to return a function for setState. And we can just use it like we're used to using it going forward. So now I can recreate count the way we had it before. So I'll just delete this for a second. So the way we had it before is we had an h1. Okay. And then we had like this. I mean, not this. Now it's just props.word space, or actually colon space, and then here we're going to have state dot count, because again now there's no this. This is not a this is not a class anymore. So none of that this stuff. Okay, h1. Okay. And then we need to create a button. But first we're going to create that add1 function. So here I would just create the function inside the, so const add1, because we're in a normal function now, so I just define functions like normal, not like I do in my classes. So add1 equals no parameters, and all this does is basically set state, and then we put in the new state, and the new state is going to be count state dot count plus 1. So same exact logic as before. And now we create our button. On click equals. Now here I don't have to bind it. That's another beauty of function components. No binding. Yay! I can just do this. Add 1. I don't even have to write this. It's just add 1. Okay, and click me / button. Cool. And then this we should end up in the same place. Cool. And if I click this, it works just like before. It's just slightly different syntax. Okay. So again, in a class component, I always have to make sure I do the constructor, and I'm using this for all my variables. But with function components, know this. But you do have a little, gotta get a little fancy with get state using what's called a hook. This is called the use state hook. But it works pretty much the same way. Again, you have your state, then you have set state. Just no more this, no more having to bind your events. This is just a much more sort of elegant syntax. So nowadays, newer React apps use this syntax, but older React apps use class. So that's why you need to know both, and you need to know to do everything in both. Especially if you're going to be doing React as part of your career and be a high-level React developer. So hopefully this was a good introduction, and now you start playing with it, make some components, have some fun with it, and I will talk to you later. Have a good one. Ciao.